Hey friendo, Steve here. Welcome back to the channel. So a couple days ago, I posted on the community tab here at WrestleJuice a question for the friendos out there, the viewers of WrestleJuice, the WrestleJuice community. What got you into wrestling? Just kind of curious. I'll be honest with you. I had no intention on making a video out of this. I figured, hey, the community tab is there for engagement, so I might as well engage with the friendos out there and see, because I was just kind of curious. I was, and so when I saw the responses, like 151 people responded with their own answer to the question, what made you a wrestling fan? And I was like, wow, this is actually really interesting stuff. Maybe I'll just make it into a video, because why not? It's kind of what we do here at WrestleJuice. We take interesting things. We take things that interest me about wrestling, and I figure if it interests me about wrestling, maybe it'll interest you. Are there any trends that stick out? What eras got people into wrestling? Is there anything that happened recently? Did anybody get into wrestling during the Thunderdome era? If this community tab thread is to be believed, no, nobody got into wrestling during Thunderdome era. But a couple things were pretty interesting. They stuck out. So we're going to go over the stuff that sort of stood out to me, the trends, if you will, and then we're going to take a look at some of your actual responses, because some of them are really cool stories, and, it's pretty neat. We're a whole community here, right? That's what we're trying to do. Anyways, let's see here. A couple things I noticed. Far and away. Actually, not far and away, but there's two eras in wrestling that seemed to be most important when it came to getting people in to wrestling. And of course, the number one thing is the Attitude Era. That's right. Stone Cold Steve Austin and the Attitude Era really were the things that a lot of people, so out of the respondents, about 24 out of the 150. And granted, you have to understand that these are all just people that are typing stuff. So maybe they said, hey, when I was a kid, I used to watch. Well, that could have been at any time. But in terms of specific, it's like things that were specifically named, Attitude Era is way up there. Like 24 of the respondents specifically mentioned Attitude Era stuff. 19 responded with things that happened in sort of the PG/modern era. So there did seem to be a distinct number of people who who got into wrestling between like 2009, 2010, and up to around 2016. You didn't see a whole lot of people saying anything about 2017, 18, 19, or current. There were a couple here and there, but there were quite a few people that responded. About 19 people responded that they got into wrestling around in the past 10 years or so. Similarly, the exact same number, and by the way, I am not a statistician. There's nothing scientific about any of this. I was just going through, just counting. Oh, he said JBL versus Eddie Guerrero. Yeah, okay. So I notched that as one. So also the Ruthless Aggression Era, 19 people specifically mentioned something from the Ruthless Aggression Era that got them into wrestling. The golden era of the WWF, I guess that's what they call it, right? The rock and wrestling stuff, Hogan, all them. 11 people. So a couple old timers here at WrestleJuice. Of course, all ages are welcome. But yeah, people have fond memories of the Hogan days. Absolutely. Only a couple people, not very many people. Only 3 specifically said, I got into it during the New Generation. And I think like 2 of them were Shawn Michaels references, and one of them was like a Razor Ramon reference. So a couple people got into it thanks to the New Generation. 6 people specifically mentioned WCW during the Monday Night Wars. Goldberg was mentioned often in those respondents. And then let's see here. One thing that really stood out to me was the sheer number of people that referenced video games as their entry to professional wrestling. That to me was very interesting, because it makes you wonder, because some of those older games have such great nostalgia value. And even some people mentioned guys like Going In Raw founder Dan Nerd Cubed as his gameplay series I think he did WWE 12 and then he did 13 and 14, and he would do like roster breakdowns and he would do funny gameplay. A lot of people actually got into wrestling by watching other YouTubers play the video games. But of course, a lot of people just played the games themselves and that got them into wrestling. And it makes you wonder, what kind of hit is WWE looking at, just generally speaking, when they miss a year due to a shitty game, or if they just have a shitty game come out like the last one, WWE 2K20. If the games are losing their quality, then is that keeping people from getting into their product? Similarly, if AEW hits a home run with their upcoming AEW console game, whatever that's going to be called, if that's based off of the same engine from some of those classic THQ games from back in the day, which is seemingly that's the case, are they going to be able to attract a whole new fan base based on that video game if it ends up being a solid game that gets a lot of buzz and a lot of people are playing it? That's a possibility that they'll be able to attract more fans to their product just by having a good video game out there on the shelves. I know people won't buy stuff off shelves. It's all downloadable these days, but you get what I'm saying. A couple other interesting tidbits here from this thread. In terms of names, well, number one of the more interesting things was the number of people who mentioned getting into wrestling when they were a child, or when they used the word young, or when they talked about other people in their school having watched it. So basically kids getting into wrestling via their friends or just sitting down and watching it with their parents who are also into it, had the most number of respondents specifically reference that. I had like around 40 of those people talk specifically about getting into it when they were kids. It doesn't mean that, only 40 got into it when they were kids. It could be other people as well who just specifically mentioned other aspects of how they got into wrestling and didn't mention them specifically being kids. Again, I'm just using finding keywords and stuff. So that was kind of interesting. In terms of actual wrestlers being referenced, The Undertaker actually by far was listed 21 times in this thread. Rey Mysterio's name came up a bunch. Jeff Hardy's name came up a bunch. Hogan's, Triple H's, and then John Cena's and Rey Mysterio's were all names that were sort of up there that were referenced specifically by the various respondents. AEW is mentioned once, but a couple times in terms of people who came back to it because of AEW. TNA was mentioned once, which is kind of interesting. And the current crop of dudes known as Cultaholic were referenced as What Culture, but back in 2016 or 17 or whatever, when they were What Culture. So Cultaholic gets some credit also for being the reason somebody got into wrestling. Kind of cool. A couple people also, I know it's because specific to me, referenced, one person specifically mentioned going in Raw as getting somebody into wrestling because they were a fan of our stuff from 10 for the Win, which is kind of interesting that we were able to actually bring somebody brand new who had never watched wrestling into wrestling just because it's us. Kind of neat. So anyways, let's go through some of these answers here because I thought that was kind of cool. Here we go. This is the thing. Joseph here says, for me, it was the Raw SmackDown versus Raw games. I loved them growing up, and they made me interested in WWE as a whole. DJ Sedex here says, simple answer, Sting. His story of becoming Crow Sting, to be exact. The Speared says SmackDown versus Raw. Tom Gebb here says, I remember flipping through channels when I was a kid and Stone Cold hit Undertaker in the face with his shovel. Who couldn't forget that? F here says, for me, it was Rey Mysterio. I was a kid when he had his second world title reign. He was always my favorite. Here's a Jeff Hardy reference from Cynical Deviant. Lone Wolf Josh here says, I was born into it. My dad ran a small local federation in our area and went to it every Saturday night. That sounds really cool. That sounds really neat. Grizz says, when I was a kid, I remember one of my uncles always watching wrestling, so I've been a fan of it since. Another Jeff Hardy reference here from Bob Calamardo. Let's see here. Nate says, I've been a fan since 5 and no one else watched wrestling. I found it flipping channels and was hooked. But the first I remember is Heenan and Mean Gene. Maybe I'll do another one of these when I ask everybody what is the first match you remember watching. Claudio says Triple H versus Randy Orton. The Noah DeCamp Show says kindergarten. I would watch Raw with my mom on the weeks I didn't have to go to school the next day. And eventually I started to watch SmackDown. Here we go. Director Bones mentions NerdCube's 2K16 career mode playthrough, and ended up getting into it after seeing the Wyatt family in the game, and immediately needed to know more about who these guys are. So you introduce your characters through the video games. It's kind of cool. People might get into it from that. Speaking of which, Undrifted Pop here says Kane and Undertaker's match at Hell in a Cell. Ultimataco mentions Batista putting Triple H through a table at Mania, thinking it was the coolest thing ever. That was pretty cool. Gaming with Cubby says CM Punk. He just had that look I can kind of relate to. I always thought that was the thing about CM Punk, is that he didn't look like anybody else. He looked more like a friend you'd meet at a bar, like a dude who'd be hanging at a dive bar, which obviously is ironic because he's straight edge. Let's see here. Frankie here mentions being 5 or 6 years old at the time. Lewis Harwood says, when I first saw Scott Steiner walking out with Amazing Pyro, I thought it was really cool. Then I saw Sting, Kidman, NWO, and Goldberg. I knew it was in for something special. Yeah, WCW had a lot of variety in their programming then. Let's see here. Asian Mirror says the SmackDown versus Raw games, 2006 in particular, caught my eye with the cover. Let's see here. Jaeger Lang says, I was 5 when I got into wrestling, and it was via a neighbor's skybox watching WWF on Sundays, either before or after The Simpsons. I don't remember what I liked. I just did. Gamers X said when SmackDown first came onto the air. This is a really cool one here. I love this one from Deadpool Nerd. Says The Rock during 2000, 2001. As a little kid then, I didn't really understand race and nationalities much. My logic was, I'm Puerto Rican, I'm brown, he's a shade of brown like me. Oh, he's Puerto Rican also. That makes him my cousin. That is like one of my favorite responses here, and it kind of goes to show that representation really does matter. It's totally true. You have a variety of cultures on your show, you're going to attract more people because more people will relate potentially to a variety of people on your show. It's kind of interesting. I love that. Young Holden says, Stone Cold Steve Austin hitting everyone in sight with a stunner to close Monday Night Raw. That could have been any number of Monday Night Raws back then. Holger says, I saw a Cena versus Big Show rap battle on YouTube. That was my introduction to wrestling. Similarly, I wonder how many people might have gotten into it thanks to the New Day versus the Usos rap battle. I thought that was a really cool sequence. Musa Key Vine says, I randomly saw Daniel Bryan on the TV when I was 9 and became a fan for life. He's going to be an AEW fan coming up here soon if he's not already. Zoe Conrana said, when I was 8, the first feud I was introduced to was Eddie versus Ray on SmackDown. Let's see here. Adam Hunter said, not as a kid, but when I moved out at 18, the 2 dudes I live with were big fans of it, so they got me into it. That's how I got into it. Hanging out with Larson and Hilton and Jeff, they were all into wrestling. I think it was Hilton who was like sort of dragging everybody to wrestling back then. So yeah, that's how I got into it in college. I was just hanging out with people who were into it. I was like, this is my crew, so I guess I'm going to have to be into it too. Jake C. mentioned SmackDown versus Raw 2007, but he didn't actually watch any shows till Money in the Bank 2011. Stone Cold here for one peak of pain. Stanley Washington mentions our show, Going in Raw. Ken Griffith says, digging down deep, it was one of those situations where my mother was a fan, not a heavy fan, but watched it on and off when my older brother and I eventually got hooked and started emulating our favorite wrestlers at the time. We also thought those Stacker 2 energy drink commercials they played during Raw were pretty great. Let's see here. John Wright says, my dad watching with me in the early 90s laid the groundwork. In about 97, I got way into Wild Stories and Constant Action. Let's see here. Here we go. Stupid People, Stupid Things says, weird you'd ask. You and Larson, I was a hardcore 10 for the Win fan. And when you left Machinima, I literally started watching Raw to understand what you were talking about. And I've been watching ever since. That's really cool. I like that. Let's see here. Carry Out Cashew says, as a kid, my dad had a VHS of Rey Mysterio winning the Royal Rumble. What got me back into wrestling after I dropped off? Brock versus The Undertaker around 2015 to 2016 with a mix of What Culture and others. Dino Faced Individual mentioned finding some content of theirs on Netflix about 10 years ago. He got back into it recently because of a YouTuber I liked playing 2K19. Lucian Hicks here mentions ECW in 97. Maximilian the Great mentions seeing Paige, and he said it just snowballed from there. Sam B mentions the Triple H, Angle, and Steph love triangle. That was good stuff. Let's see here. Oh, I like this. Toby Wolfcastle says AAA and WWF with my dad as a youngin'. Sean Hammond mentions the CM Punk pipe bomb. Marvell says Double or Nothing got me back in love with wrestling. Currently, though, my buddy had a ticket, and since then I've been a mad lad for it, like when I was a kid again. Don Shin mentions Goldberg. He was a superhero to me, and he loved the moves of the cruiserweights. The summer of 2013 for Ethan. Let's see here. My parents watched it. Dylan says seeing Undertaker kick ass on SmackDown 2007 on a random Sunday afternoon. Sean again mentioned SmackDown versus Raw 2006. And my parents got me the Best of Raw 2009 DVD, and he's been hooked ever since. Darth Muppet, the first match I saw was Rey Mysterio versus Kevin Nash. The first time Rey beat Nash. Let's see here. Again, Undertaker in the gray gloves, being starstruck by his appearance. Let's see here. Well, Wilson Simon says, I was just watching America's Home Videos, and after that it was WWE Superstars in 2010. First match was CM Punk versus JTG. FSI mentions Goldberg. We have some Cena and Hardy stuff. Let's see here. Here we go. Jay Singh says, Survivor Series 2016 got me watching week to week, paying for the network and everything. Just happened to catch a SmackDown rerun of the build to Survivor Series. The final elimination match was just so fun. That's totally true. This is interesting. He says, was at a party. WWE was on the TV, and the rest is history. Barbara Weiler says, as a young girl, I was drawn in by the larger-than-life characters right before the first WrestleMania. I fell in love with the bad guys like Piper and Savage. I stopped watching in the middle of the Attitude Era because I got married, had kids, and all that fun stuff. Got back into wrestling after seeing the whole Bloody Becky incident. That was only a couple of years ago. That's kind of interesting. Big Papa Pringle says, watching TNA with my dad around 2012, 2013. Simply Garbage says, I got into it during the Roman versus Triple H feud around the Rumble. Didn't know any of Roman's past, but I knew Triple H from the SmackDown and Raw games. Let's see here. Manuel mentions Austin 316. Ant Lover says, everyone was a wrestling fan at school, so I started becoming a fan as well. So there's all sorts of answers here. There's like 150 of these, but these are pretty interesting. Kai Eastwood, my uncle gave me and my brother a copy of Mania 25, and the combination of the Money in the Bank ladder match and Taker and Shawn got us hooked. Dex Baker says the original SmackDown game. Yeah, this is it's I love this kind of stuff. I love this kind of stuff because it's just cool. Like all throughout the last 30, 40 years, people getting into wrestling, and now here we are today. So let me know in the comments below if you didn't respond here. Number one, if you did and I didn't read your comment, I apologize. There's just a lot of them to get through. But if you didn't respond here, let us know in the comments what got you into wrestling. Did you fall out? Did you come back to it? Let us know. Hit that like button. Hit that subscribe button. Want to thank everybody for tuning in. Check out one of these other videos while you're at it. We've got a whole bunch of different videos here on the channel. And then I'm going to drop an AMA video tomorrow. So there's also a thread on the community tab with an AMA thread. It's got Lex Luger in it, I think is what I did. So yeah, check these videos out, and thanks for watching.